Next speaker is from Wales, and as I mentioned before, she was a Welsh Woman of the Year in 1996. She's one of Europe's leading palliative care consultants. She's also a crossbench peer in the UK House of Lords, where she's opposed efforts to introduce legislation for assisted suicide over the last 20 years. She's patron of the Motor Neuron Disease Association, as well as being involved in a number of other relevant charities to this issue. Baroness Ilora Finlay of Llandaff. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. You're very welcome.
Yes. Thank you so much for inviting me today. I have put a few slides together just to illustrate some points. I'm going to try to share my screen now, if everyone can bear with me just for a moment while I do, and we'll get the slideshow going. I want to talk to you from the perspective of somebody who has been looking at whether you legislate on any issue and how you legislate, because that's something I've learned since I've been in Parliament. But my background, as you said, was palliative care. Connor has made some very, very important points, and I think I will probably be stressing some of those too. First of all, dignity. Cicely Saunders said dignity is having a sense of personal worth. Dignity is something which you can either enhance or you can destroy by the way somebody is behaved towards. If you make patients feel like they're on a conveyor belt or a lump of meat, you take away their dignity. If you treat them with respect and look at the things that they need, you enhance their dignity. And Cicely also said, you matter because you are you, and you matter to the last moment of your life. We will do all we can not only to help you die peacefully, but also live until you die. That has been the philosophy of palliative care ever since it really started in these islands. I've just recently written a book, which some of you may have come across, because there's a lot of heat and slogan around this topic, but what we tried to do was really analyze it and stand back and say, this is a very complicated subject. I think the first question that you need to ask yourself is, does the law need to change? And if you change it, is what will come in its place better than what you had before? And one of the big concerns here is that we have suicide prevention policies everywhere, and the whole of our clinical services are meant to look at preventing suicide. And all of a sudden with legislation like this, you say, well, however, there's a group who can say they want to have their life ended by somebody else, help with suicide, and we make a hole in those suicide prevention laws for them, but the group is really poorly defined and it relates to whether they ask for it or not. I also want to quickly point out that stopping treatment is not euthanasia. And sticking with the suicide just for a moment, it's important to be clear, in all the places that have changed their legislation, there is no drop in their suicide rates. In fact, they tend to go up and be very high. There's also no drop in their violent suicides, and there's no drop in their suicides amongst people who have an underlying illness. Those haven't disappeared. They've plateaued, but they haven't gone away. So changing the law does not stop people who are ill committing suicide or killing themselves or seeking help to be killed. But what it does is you change the tone in society so that killing people somehow becomes more acceptable. Why do people seek death? Well, as Connor said, the Oregon data where it's assisted suicide shows it is about being less able to engage in activities that make life enjoyable and being a burden on family or caregivers. Those are the top reasons. Those are social reasons, they're not medical reasons. Way down the list, second from the bottom, is inadequate control of pain or concern about it. And I would remind all of you who are doctors on this call that pain is multifactorial and is an experience of physical stimulus to pain made worse by social, emotional, and spiritual anguish. If you feel that you're a burden, you feel your pain worse. If you're unhappy, your pain feels worse to you. Your pain experience is total. But it's worth noting, this is not the reason that people are seeking death by and large, although the campaigners would have the slogans and get people to vote in a poll using pain and fear of pain as the lever. Let's just look for a moment whether stopping treatment when it's no longer doing any good is euthanasia. It is not. Let's take motor neuron disease, but you could take chemotherapy. For example, the person would have died of their disease without their treatment, without the intervention. If someone has non-invasive ventilation with motor neuron disease, and it's quite common now, and it will keep them well and able to do things with the different devices that they have, they're dependent on the ventilator. When they say, I accept that I'm now dying, I can do no more, I want to come off the ventilator, they die of their underlying disease, and those looking after them must provide care during that time, and we know how to do it. We know how to keep people gently, peacefully slipping away, and they die, but they die much later than they would have died without the intervention. They're accepting that they're going to die of their disease anyway. Completely different to seeking death when you want to have lethal drugs with the intention to end your life, when your own death might have been months or years later. And I caution anyone who thinks we can predict how long somebody will live, because we can't. We are hopeless at prognosis. I've looked after thousands and thousands of patients, and all I can tell you is I can't tell how long someone's going to live. I've got people who I thought would be dead within weeks, and they've been alive years later. I've also sadly had people who I thought would live for a year or two, and they've died very rapidly. We just can't tell. So what's happened in other countries? Well, I only put these graphs in just to show you the trend. In all the places that have changed the law, the numbers go up and up and up. Canada, interestingly, down the bottom where the red graphs are, is not revealing its data now. That steep rise, that incremental extension, they're trying to extend it in law even further, but they're keeping their data out of sight, which is really worrying. And we know that even when you look at the data reported, there are shortcomings. The estimate is that from Belgium, for example, only 40% or so that are going on. They're not reported at all. If we look at it on a UK basis, the Netherlands, Belgian experience, which is a bit similar to this law before you, it's not a small number. It'd be about 1 in 24 of all deaths. Now, for the UK, that would be about 23,000. I haven't done the sums for Ireland, but I don't think it would be that difficult to take all of your deaths and say, well, what would the numbers be if it was 1 in 24 of all the deaths here? Because that's what's happened. On the Netherlands graph, you will have noticed it had plateaued a bit, and that's the level that they're at now. Are there unintended consequences? Yes, there are. An article in the Washington Post just in the last few days said Canada is plunging toward a human rights disaster for disabled people, that the laws are leading to inadequate care. And the picture of the man in the bed is sadly somebody who felt he had to go to court to try to get the care that he needed to live well with his disability. And the answer he got was that what he needed wouldn't be funded, but that he could have lethal drugs. And we've seen the same happen in Oregon and other places. The other thing is that we know now that there are some hospices that have lost their funding, and that actually palliative care in all these jurisdictions has not developed as much as it has in other parts of the world. And whilst I have huge respect for palliative care in Ireland, I do think you have a bit of a way to go with your service provision. It's not everywhere. It's not 24/7 everywhere. And you just don't have enough clinical staff yet trained, and neither are there in the UK. There are very good services where the services are, but there are gaps. And those need to be addressed before you even think about changing the law in this direction. And there's also moral injury to the staff. It takes its toll. Nobody should underestimate that. What does this do to society? What does it do to the attitude of the doctors? We know, because the Oregon do produce their data, that some doctors seem to prescribe very readily. And there's doctor shopping goes on. So people will move around to get someone to prescribe their lethal drugs. You've got this bill before you. Well, you could shoot holes in just about every line of it. But to say, is somebody terminally ill? You just can't tell. Take somebody like Baroness Campbell, who has, since the age of 15, been deemed to be terminally ill. She's now, I think, 56. She's on a ventilator in her wheelchair, comes into the House of Lords on her ventilator, speaks in debates, and on Monday, she's probably going to call a vote on the domestic abuse bill, trying to protect people from domestic abuse. She has been terminally ill for the whole of her life. The number of times that we've all thought that she wouldn't last a day or two has been more than the fingers I've got on both hands. How do you judge somebody has a clear and settled intention? Well, a very interesting study published just in the last few days has shown that actually people's desire for death vacillates. It goes between seeking death, wanting death, accepting death, and then wanting to live and having great joy, even in some small moments. And it is at least a year before you can say that somebody's intention is settled. And even then, it's probably 2 years. It's an interesting study to look at. Obviously, there are all kinds of implications politically because of the way the bill's worded, but that, I'm afraid, is something which I'm going to stand back from completely. But what do you actually do? The public out there think, well, you have one pill and you take it, and it almost like the cyanide pill that was sewn into the petticoat of the resistance people in the Second World War. Well, taking cyanide is a terrible way to die, actually. That's not what it is. You have to take a whole stack of drugs. And interestingly, if you were to dissolve it, it would be about a large tumbler full, almost like a half-pint glass, it'd be a glass full to dissolve it all. And you drink that down. In Oregon, where they have produced the data, they've had some patients, I think it's 8 at the latest count, have woken up again. And it isn't that you die within 5 or 10 minutes. Sometimes it's gone on for over 100 hours. Now, what is assistance? And how do you judge whether assistance to take it is coercive assistance? Oh, come on, mum, it's about time you took your drugs. They're there in the cupboard. We've been holding them onto them for a bit. The worn out family, the people who really feel it's a burden. But then what about the drugs that are used in euthanasia that are injected? Now, this is really very worrying too, because it's a short acting anesthetic agent. And then the person is totally paralyzed with curare. It's the same as used in executions, lethal drugs in executions in the US. And the person who's completely paralyzed can't move a muscle, they can't breathe, they die of asphyxia. We don't know whether they wake up again or not, but a post-mortem study on some of these patients shows that actually their lungs are filled with fluid. It's as if they're drowned in their own secretions. So this isn't a gentle, peaceful death. It just looks peaceful because they can't move a muscle and they're paralyzed. Some people die before they have the curare in, but the protocols that are used for administering them are really worrying. And then these bits of legislation talk about a cooling off period, a 14 days and that it could be shortened to 6 days. Well, I don't want to sound too flippant, but I bought a fridge recently, and the cooling off day, I had 28 days to cool off just for buying a fridge. The evidence is that in 14 days, or even in 6 days, you'd have to work really intensively with somebody to get on top of all of their problems. It's setting an unrealistic boundary. And it's too dangerous because people switch between wanting to die and wanting to live. And I've had countless patients who have said, I feel terrible, I don't want to carry on. And within a few days have said, I never believed I could feel so well again. I never believed I could enjoy life again. So this is really dangerous, what's being proposed. And I don't think that it's wise for the population to go down this route and say, well, we'll have suicide prevention policies for some, but not others. And these are the drugs that we'll administer without even being honest with the population about what the process actually involves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Baroness Ilora Finlay, for sharing with us, and I hope you can